Welcome to Occult Archives, where we uncover the mysteries, myths, and legends behind history's most feared books,
From mystical grimoires.
to ancient religious texts.
These books carry secrets too dangerous to be read.
I'm your host,
And I'm the expert.
and today we have a really interesting one.
Episode 178.
Demonology and the Mind, Walter Scott's Rational Witchcraft.
So we're going on a deep dive into a fascinating historical document, Sir Walter Scott's Letters on Demonology and Witchcraft.
Yeah, this is a text that I think a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with, at least by title.
Right. It's one of those that's kind of out there.
Absolutely. And it's one that I think raises a lot of questions about, the roots of beliefs that we might consider superstitions today.
Absolutely. And Scott was writing this in the early 1830s.
Towards the end of his life.
Yeah, a remarkable life and career.
Absolutely. So what we're going to try to do today is really get into Scott's exploration of these topics. Looking at the origins he suggests for a belief in the supernatural, how people have perceived and interpreted these phenomena over time, and really what Scott reveals about the historical understanding of demonology and witchcraft.
Yeah, one of the things that's so fascinating about this text is it's just full of these anecdotes and observations.
He was a storyteller.
Exactly. Even when he's dealing with something as seemingly dry as demonology.
He finds a way to make it come alive, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that makes this book so compelling.
So where do we begin? I mean, when you think about demonology, where does Scott begin in trying to understand why people believe in it in the first place?
Well, he starts with something pretty fundamental, and that is the idea that the human soul is immortal.
Makes sense.
That there's something of us that continues after death.
Right.
And that naturally leads to the possibility, or at least the perception, that, spirits might occasionally return.
Right. If you accept that there's an afterlife, then the occasional reappearance of a spirit doesn't seem too far-fetched.
Exactly. And Scott points out that the sort of the intellectual hurdles that someone might have in, believing in an abstract spirit.
Right.
Those don't really apply to what he calls the vulgar and ignorant.
Interesting way to put it.
Well, it's his language.
It's a different time.
And I think what he's getting at is that, the average person isn't necessarily engaged in these deep philosophical debates about immaterial beings.
Right.
It's more about the experience and what seems like direct evidence.
So he's saying it's not so much about abstract reasoning as it is about the perceived experience.
Absolutely. And, he talks about how intense passions and strong emotions can really lead people to anticipate or even dread supernatural events.
So give me an example of that. What do you mean?
Well, think about someone in the heat of battle.
Okay.
Or someone who's going through a personal crisis.
Yep.
Their mind is already kind of operating on a different level.
Sure.
And in those moments, they're much more likely to interpret, ambiguous events through a supernatural lens.
Right. Almost like a collective wish fulfillment.
That's a good way to put it.
Or like, if you're in a really intense situation and people start saying they've seen a miracle or they've seen a sign, you're more likely to believe it because you're already in that heightened state of emotion.
And he uses this analogy of like musical instruments vibrating in sympathy.
Oh, interesting.
If one person declares they've seen something, then others are more likely to kind of chime in.
Right, to kind of jump on that bandwagon.
Exactly.
And he provides some really interesting examples of this, what he calls contagious credulity.
Oh, yes.
That the account from Bernal Diaz del Castillo.
Yeah.
About the supposed appearance of Santiago during the Mexican conquest.
Right. This was something that was widely reported.
Right, and Castillo himself says.
Well, he says that he saw a man on a chestnut horse.
Right, so not exactly Santiago.
Not the shining figure that everyone else claimed to see.
Right, but instead of saying, well, that was obviously not a miracle, he questions his own worthiness.
Yeah, he's like, well, maybe I just wasn't, pure enough to see it.
Right, so it really shows you how powerful belief can be.
Absolutely.
In shaping how we interpret events, even when our own eyes tell us something different.
And then there's the example from Scotland with Peter Walker.
Yeah.
Who accepted the supernatural explanation for the aurora borealis.
The Northern Lights.
Northern Lights, yeah, simply based on what others had told him.
Right, because it was such an uncommon sight.
People just jumped to a supernatural explanation.
Right.
And Walker, even though he didn't see anything particularly extraordinary himself.
He didn't see angels or demons.
No.
But he accepted their interpretation.
And, Walker was considered to be a reputable man.
So it just shows you how easily even seemingly rational individual.
And can get caught up in these extraordinary beliefs.
Especially when there's that kind of atmosphere of wonder or apprehension.
Right. If everyone around you is saying this is a sign from God or this is a demon, then
You're more likely to believe it.
you're more likely to believe it.
Now, Scott also explores this idea that these apparent supernatural experiences can sometimes arise from what he calls a depraved state of the bodily organs.
This is where it gets really interesting.
So it sounds like he's hinting at physiological explanations.
He is, but he's careful to distinguish this from insanity,
Okay.
where the mind itself is disordered.
So he's not saying that these people are crazy.
No, he's saying that there's something physically wrong
Okay.
that's affecting their senses.
So the senses are malfunctioning, but the mind is still intact.
Exactly.
And he gives some pretty vivid examples of this, the London man of pleasure who saw dancing green figures in his drawing room.
Yeah, that one's pretty striking.
That's a good one.
And his physician immediately linked this to his lifestyle.
Well, yeah, too much pleasure.
Right? Too much rich food, too much wine, not enough sleep.
Not enough exercise.
Exactly. And he recommended a more temperate existence.
Yeah.
And the green figures vanished.
Oh, so he cleaned up his act and the hallucinations went away.
It seems so.
That's fascinating.
Which, really suggests a direct connection between physical well-being and sensory perception.
Makes you think.
It does.
And then there's the case of the German bookseller and philosopher Nikolai.
Now, this one's really interesting because Nikolai was a very intelligent man.
Right, not someone you would typically associate with superstitious beliefs.
Exactly.
But he had these persistent visual apparitions.
And, these weren't just fleeting glimpses.
Right.
He was seeing people both living and dead.
For hours at a time.
For hours at a time.
That's wild.
And he kept very detailed accounts of these apparitions.
Which eventually subsided as his health improved.
Right.
So again, another case where physical ailment seems to have been a factor.
It really does lend support to Scott's idea.
And then there are the examples from Dr. Gregory's patient, who was visited by an old hag, and the eminent Scottish lawyer, who saw a gentleman usher followed by a skeleton.
Now, the lawyer's experience is particularly interesting because the initial apparition, the gentleman usher, wasn't particularly scary.
Right.
It was just kind of odd.
But then it escalated.
It was too scary.
Right, a clear manifestation of, morbid imagination.
And what's remarkable is that the lawyer himself recognized that it wasn't real.
Right.
But the emotional distress it caused him was very real.
And there's that great quote where he says, "Science, philosophy, even religion has no cure for such a disorder."
Right.
Really highlighting the power of these visions, even when you know they're not real.
Absolutely.
And then Scott mentions these brief, almost momentary apparitions like those experienced by Maupertuis and the late illustrious modern poet.
Right, these kind of fleeting visions.
Right, just these glimpses.
And what's interesting is that these were encountered by individuals who were considered to be of sound mind. So it suggests that even in those with very strong minds...
You can have these temporary sensory illusions.
Exactly. And, if you're living in a time period where people are more credulous...
Right.
Then it's easy to see how these could be interpreted as genuine supernatural encounters.
Absolutely. And he mentions that the poet famously said, "No, madam, I have seen too many myself."
Yeah, almost like he'd become accustomed to these tricks of perception.
Right, and that familiarity had led to skepticism.
Exactly.
Now, he also talks about delusions affecting other senses.
Not just sight.
Right, like hearing the wild huntsman.
Right.
Which, that legend is so pervasive.
And it probably originated from, misinterpretations of natural sound.
Right, like the wind howling through the trees.
Exactly, or animals moving about at night.
Amplified by imagination.
And existing folklore.
Right.
So you have these kind of basic ingredients,
Oh, yeah.
and then you add in a little bit of fear and superstition.
And you've got yourself a legend.
Exactly.
He also talks about delusions of touch during sleep.
Yeah, and even taste and smell.
It's amazing how easily our senses can be misled.
Especially when you combine that with a predisposition to believe in the supernatural.
Right, so if you already believe in ghosts, you're more likely to interpret a strange sound or a cold spot as a ghost.
Absolutely.
Now, shifting gears a bit, Scott also examines scriptural perspectives on witchcraft.
This is where he gets into some really interesting territory.
So what are his key findings there?
Well, he argues that the understanding of witch that was prevalent in the Middle Ages, this idea of someone who's in league with the devil wielding supernatural powers to inflict harm.
Right, like the classic image of the witch.
Exactly.
That doesn't really align with the figures that are described in the Bible.
Right.
And he looks at both the Old and New Testaments to support this claim.
He does.
So let's start with the Old Testament. What's his interpretation of the word witch in that context?
Well, he points out that the Hebrew word that's often translated as witch, words like chasaph,
Okay.
might have originally had a meaning that was closer to poisoner.
Oh, interesting. Or a more general term for someone who practiced, forbidden arts of divination.
So not necessarily the kind of witch that we think of today.
Not at all.
So more like someone who's using natural substances.
Or engaging in fortune-telling,
Right.
but practices that were seen as outside the accepted religious boundaries.
So it's more about religious disobedience than supernatural power.
Exactly.
Derived from evil forces.
Right. And, a good example of this is the Witch of Endor.
Right. The woman who supposedly conjures the spirit of Samuel for King Saul.
Exactly. And Scott argues that she's portrayed more as a divining woman
Okay.
than a sorceress who's commanding demonic forces.
And he even entertains the possibility that maybe she wasn't even conjuring Samuel at all.
Right.
That maybe it was God or a benevolent spirit intervening.
To prevent Saul from being misled.
So a very nuanced interpretation.
It is.
Avoiding both the idea of her as a powerful sorceress and a complete fraud.
Exactly.
Now, what about the New Testament? How does Scott view the references to witchcraft there? Well, he notes that the word witch doesn't even appear in the Gospels.
Interesting.
And when Paul mentions witchcraft, he usually does so in the context of other sins, like idolatry.
So, again, suggesting that it's more about forbidden practices
Exactly.
than about actual supernatural power.
Right.
And then there are the sorcerers that are mentioned in Revelation.
Right. Figures like LMS and Simon Magus.
Right.
But Scott argues that these were more likely charlatans making false claims of supernatural power.
Than actual wielders of dark magic.
Right.
So the New Testament doesn't really describe the kind of witch that caused so much fear and persecution in Europe during the Middle Ages.
That's Scott's conclusion.
So where does he think that concept came from?
Well, he believes that it developed later during a period of less enlightenment when pagan gods and beliefs were demonized by Christians.
Right. So as Christianity spread, the gods and practices of non-Christian populations were often reinterpreted as being demonic. Whether it was the Saracens or the unconverted peoples of Northern Europe, or even the deities of civilizations like the Aztecs and the Incas.
And their priests and practitioners were seen as conjurers and wizards.
Though it was a way of understanding other religions within a Christian framework.
Right.
Essentially labeling them as devil worship.
And, the often cruel practices associated with some of these religions, like the human sacrifices in Mexico, only reinforced this perception.
Of demonic influence.
Exactly.
Even the powers or cunning men of North America were initially viewed through this lens.
Although Scott notes that Cotton Mather's account suggests that their abilities weren't particularly extraordinary.
Right, so maybe not as demonic as some people thought.
Maybe not.
Now, these older beliefs didn't just disappear with the arrival of Christianity.
Oh, no, they persisted in various forms.
Scott points to the persistence of pagan customs in Europe.
Right, like the Beltane or Beltane fire festivals in Scotland.
Oh, yeah.
Or the concept of the Goodman's Croft, a piece of land that was left untilled.
And implicitly dedicated to a malevolent spirit.
Exactly.
Interesting.
These were holdovers from pre-Christian practices, often observed without a full understanding of their original significance.
Right. So people were still doing these things, but they didn't necessarily know why.
Exactly. And even seemingly innocuous customs, like carrying the bride over the threshold or avoiding weddings in May,
Right.
have their roots in Roman paganism.
So these echoes of older beliefs really persisted for centuries.
They did.
Even after Christianity became the dominant faith.
And it's important to remember that context.
Because it helps to explain how classical and northern mythology further shapes the image of the devil in demonology.
Right. Scott talks about how figures from both of these traditions contributed to the attributes that we later associate with Satan.
So, for example...
the classical sorceresses like Erichtho and Canidia,
Right.
with their supposed powers over nature.
Right.
Or the satyrs and other woodland deities. While not all inherently evil in their original context, these figures represented supernatural forces that were outside the Christian pantheon.
So they were easy to demonize.
Exactly.
And in northern mythology, you have this idea of spirits transforming after death, sometimes becoming malevolent entities.
Right, and the Norse even had tales of challenging their deities.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Scott recounts a story of a courageous young man who essentially confronted and overcame the idol of the goddess Freya.
That's fascinating.
These stories illustrate a very different kind of relationship with the supernatural.
Right, compared to the later, more fear-driven Christian demonology.
Absolutely.
Now, he makes a particularly insightful point about the origin of Satan's physical characteristics.
The horns, the tail, the goat-like form.
Yeah, where did that come from?
Well, Scott links it to figures like Pan from classical mythology and the Celtic Arisk.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that the Arisk wasn't actually a powerful, malevolent spirit.
So not the devil.
No, Scott describes it as more of a solitary, melancholy figure
Interesting.
dwelling in the wilderness.
So, more of a tragic figure.
Yeah, and there's even this anecdote of the Urisk being tricked by someone who claimed that their name was myself.
Like Odysseus.
Exactly.
It's funny.
It kind of portrays the Urisk as more easily outwitted than a formidable devil.
Right.
And Scott suggests that the transfer of these attributes to Satan was a later development.
Maybe influenced by the biblical description of the wicked as goats and the devil as a dragon.
Right. And he actually commends Milton,
For
largely dispensing with these, what he calls vulgar puerilities.
and giving Satan a more tragic and dignified character in Paradise Lost.
Exactly.
So it seems like popular imagination really took these various cultural threads and kind of wove them together.
Into this composite figure of the Christian devil.
The devil we know today.
Exactly.
Now, another significant aspect of folklore that Scott examines is the fairy superstition.
Fairies.
Where does he believe those beliefs originated?
Well, he traces them back to a few different sources. He points to the classical worship of sylvans, or deities of the woods and countryside.
So like a personification of nature.
In a way, yes.
Okay.
And he cites Roman altars dedicated to Sylvanus that have been found in Britain.
As evidence that this worship was happening.
Exactly.
And he also talks about the Gothic Duergar, or dwarfs,
Right.
whom he suggests may be linked to the northern Lapps, or Finns.
Yeah, the Nibelungenlied and the story of King Lauren are good examples from these traditions.
Featuring subterranean beings with magical skills.
Exactly.
So already we're seeing a connection to the fairy myth,
We are.
and then there are the Celtic fairies.
Now they have a slightly different character.
In what way?
Well, they're often depicted as more lighthearted and pleasure-seeking,
Oh.
but their joys are often illusory.
Yeah.
And they're also known for abducting humans, both infants and adults.
Into their otherworldly realm.
Exactly.
So there's that dark side.
There is.
He tells the story of an Irish butler who narrowly avoided being taken by the fairies.
Because he heeded a warning not to partake in their revels or their work.
Good advice.
And there was also a widespread belief that elves paid a kind of tax to hell,
Really?
suggesting a kind of hierarchy within the supernatural world.
So even the fairies had to answer to someone.
It seems so.
These beliefs were prevalent across Ireland, Wales, the Highlands, and the Isle of Man,
And then you have the northern traditions of fairies.
which tend to be a bit darker.
Much darker.
Right? Figures like Merlin Arthur and Thomas of Ercildoune are all said to have been carried off by fairies in northern folklore.
Right.
And the story of Thomas the Rhymer's encounter with the Fairy Queen, his time in Elfland, and his return with a gift of prophecy.
It's a classic.
It is, and the heart and hind that lead him away.
Yeah, what do you make of those?
I think they symbolize the alluring but potentially dangerous nature of the fairy realm.
Exactly.
And Reginald Scott mentions a similar tale.
Indicating how widespread these narratives were.
It's amazing how these different cultural influences, classical, Gothic, Celtic, and northern,
All contributed to this complex tapestry of fairy belief.
in Europe.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Now let's turn our attention to the historical accounts of witches and their practices that Scott presents.
These are often quite disturbing.
They are, and they really illustrate the mindset of the time.
The fear, the suspicion, the willingness to believe.
So let's start with some specific cases.
Okay.
Scott recounts the case of Bessie Dunlop, who claimed to have interacted with the spirit of Tom Reed.
Who died at the Battle of Pinkie.
Right, and her descriptions of him and their interactions are quite detailed.
They are.
And what's interesting is that she maintains her Christian faith throughout.
Right, so she doesn't see herself as being in league with the devil.
It's more like she's having this strange, perhaps unwelcome connection to the spirit world.
Exactly.
And then there's the accusation against Lady Phallus for allegedly attempting to harm Robert Monroe through witchcraft.
Now, this case highlights how personal conflicts, especially among those of higher social standing,
Right.
could easily escalate into accusations of sorcery.
It was a way to get back at someone.
It was.
To discredit them.
Especially if you couldn't prove anything else.
Now, Scott also brings in Reginald Scott.
the noted skeptic.
Yes,
Yeah.
and his list of supposed bugbears.
Emphasizing that these beliefs were starting to decline during his era.
So Scott was a real pioneer in challenging these superstitions.
He was. And his work was a significant contribution to a more rational understanding of these phenomena.
And he wasn't alone,
No, you also had figures like Weir and Naudet.
who were also questioning the reality of witchcraft.
Exactly.
But it's important to remember that even these early challengers were still limited by the scientific understanding of their time.
Right.
They might question witchcraft,
But still believe in things like weapon salve or sympathetic powder.
which today we would consider magical thinking.
It was a different time.
It was.
The scientific revolution was still in its early stages.
And so many of the accepted explanations for natural events now seem quite fantastical to us.
It was a complex intellectual landscape where even skeptics operated within a framework that still contained elements of what we would now consider superstition.
Right.
It's important to keep that in mind.
Absolutely. Now, Scott also recounts some truly harrowing historical examples of witch trials,
Oh, yes.
like the Eras trials with their forced confession,
Extracted through torture.
which is just a grim reminder of the brutality and injustice that could result from widespread fear,
And the desperate search for scapegoats.
especially during times of social upheaval.
Exactly.
Monstrelet's account of the Eras trials clearly shows the role of manipulation and false accusations,
Driven by self-interest and malice.
and the inconsistencies in the descriptions of witches' gatherings as observed by DeLong.
They really highlight the unreliability of the testimonies.
If these individuals were truly participating in these organized demonic rituals, why were their accounts so different?
And often contradictory.
It suggests that they were making it up.
Or at least being heavily influenced by their interrogators.
Now, the Swedish witch trials and even the king's skepticism during those events are also quite telling.
Yes, King Charles XI was actually quite cautious in his response to the accusations.
He recognized that the evidence might not be as solid as it seemed.
He was aware of the possibility of false accusations and mass hysteria.
Which is remarkable considering the time period.
It really is a glimpse of rationality amidst a climate of fear.
Scott also discusses the influence of different religious denominations on witchcraft beliefs and persecutions,
Right.
noting that those of a Calvinist persuasion tended to be the most zealous.
In pursuing and prosecuting accused witches.
Why do you think that was?
Well, Calvinist theology, with its strong emphasis on the power of the devil and a suspicion of anything that might be seen as remnants of Catholicism,
Right.
often fueled a particularly intense focus on rooting out perceived demonic influence.
And that led to witch hunts.
It did.
And he presents a series of specific cases that really illustrate this.
Like the Samuels who were condemned at Huntingdon and
Right.
King James I,
Who had a very strong personal belief in demonology.
which undoubtedly fueled more trials.
And then there's the case of the boy Robinson and his false accusations,
A classic example of the power of suggestion.
especially when dealing with children,
And then, of course, there's Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed witch finder general,
whose methods were notoriously cruel.
and effective in terms of extracting confessions.
Though not necessarily in terms of finding actual witches.
Right.
Each of these cases really underscores the dangers of unchecked belief
And the horrific cruelty that could be inflicted in the name of eradicating evil.
and the instances of flawed evidence are just staggering.
Like the case of Julian Cox and the Hare.
Right,
Or the trial presided over by Sir Matthew Hales.
who was considered to be a very learned man,
He was.
but even he was not immune to the prejudices and fears of his time.
And then you have the strange pronouncements of Sir Thomas Browne.
A man of science seemingly endorsing superstitious beliefs in court.
It's a reminder that even the most intelligent people can be swayed by the prevailing beliefs of their time,
And Scott also touches on the witch trials in New England.
which were heavily influenced by those Calvinist beliefs
Right.
and the accusations against Lady Glamis.
And the incredibly detailed, almost fantastical confessions of Isabel Gowdy.
Her descriptions of shape-shifting and encounters with the devil really capture the often bizarre narratives that emerge from these trials.
Likely under immense pressure and psychological manipulation.
Exactly.
And then there's the role of the so-called prickers.
Who claimed to be able to detect witch marks on the accused.
But their methods were often just trickery.
And their pronouncements fueled the persecution and enriched themselves.
It's a reminder that there was a lot of fraud and exploitation going on during this time.
There was.
And the tortures endured by accused witches like Agnes Sampson and Fian are just horrific.
The use of cords to crush Agnes's head.
The tearing out of Fian's fingernails.
It's almost impossible to imagine the level of suffering inflicted based on these beliefs.
And the sheer number of executions for witchcraft in a city like Edinburgh.
It gives you a sense of the scale of this tragic phenomenon.
And then there's the case of Margaret Barclay.
With the accusations stemming from her own sister-in-law.
And the juggler steward's forced confession.
And his mysterious death in prison.
And the contradictory testimony of the child, Margaret Talesier.
And the alleged appearance of a black dog.
And Margaret Barclay's desperate attempt to escape her fate.
It's a story that encapsulates so much of the injustice of the time.
The malicious accusations, the coerced confessions, the unreliable witnesses.
And the ultimate failure of justice.
Even the anecdote of the farmer, whose property was damaged and attributed it to witchcraft.
Right.
Where the sheriff offers a perfectly rational explanation.
But the farmer's wife still struggles to accept it.
Speaks volumes about the deep-seated power of belief.
Even in the face of logical reasoning.
Finally, Scott turns his attention to specific instances of apparitions and deception.
Moving beyond formal witchcraft accusations to more general ghost sightings.
Right, so he examines cases like the ghost reportedly seen by Towers.
Right.
Suggesting that it might have been a deliberate attempt to influence the Duke of Buckingham.
Or maybe even just a vivid dream.
And he talks about the elaborate hoax of the Woodstock ghost.
Orchestrated by parliamentary commissioners.
And the Stockwell ghost, which turned out to be the tricks of a mischievous servant girl.
So sometimes these ghost stories have very mundane explanations.
He also discusses how misinterpretations of natural phenomena could lead to ghost sightings.
Like the Brock Inspector.
Or reflections being mistaken for armies.
And he touches on the power of storytelling.
Using Defoe's Mrs. Veal's Ghost as an example.
Of a fictional narrative being widely accepted as genuine.
And he provides further instances of ghosts being explained by human agency, like the Highlander ghost.
Or by genuine mental distress.
Like the grieving maniac.
Or by simple tricks of light and sound.
So really driving home the point that many ghost stories have very mundane origins. So as you can see from this deep dive into Sir Walter Scott's work, the history of beliefs surrounding demonology and witchcraft is incredibly complex.
It's intertwined with human psychology, social anxieties, religious interpretations, and even early attempts at scientific reasoning.
Scott, writing at this pivotal time, provides a fascinating glimpse into how these beliefs were understood, challenged, and ultimately began to wane with the rise of Enlightenment thought.
And his work is still relevant today.
It is, because it forces us to confront the ways in which we continue to grapple with the unknown.
And the power of belief to shape our perceptions.
What stood out to you most in Scott's analysis?
I think for me, it's the way he balances skepticism with a genuine fascination with the supernatural.
Right, he's not dismissive of these beliefs.
No, he's trying to understand them.
And that makes his work all the more compelling.
It does.
We hope this exploration has given you some food for thought.
And maybe even sparked some further curiosity about the origins of superstition and the evolution of our understanding of the world.
Until next time, keep exploring the occult archives.